Welcome back to the Firefighter Craftsmanship podcast. We're psyched you're joining us, and we're very excited to welcome Ian Bennett, Captain Ian Bennett, today. What's up, Ian? How's it going today?
Good. It's good. Going good, Kevin. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
We've had some fun conversations over the last, I don't know, 8 months to a year, probably. And you've been very patient that I've worked through school and haven't gotten back to you for weeks or months on end, but we've had some good chats. So I'm super excited to kind of dive into talking about basic skills training for sure, and then with a edge towards human performance psychology and some of the things that you're seeing are really being kind of a thought leader in the fire service space. So we're pretty excited about some of that stuff. So tell us a little bit about who you are.
So yeah, like you said, I'm a captain. I work for the city of Seattle. I've worked my whole career with Seattle. I've been there for about a little over 18 years. It did two different 2-year stints in the training division. About 2018, I started West Coast Fire Training, which is a little side business that I have that helps. I help other departments do live fire training. Mostly, I teach classes on how to do live fire training well, safely and realistically at the same time. I'm an alternate voting member on the NFPA 1400 committee under Brian Brush, and I'm going to be a technical panel member on the upcoming UL study on basically townhomes, vertical residences, I think is what they're calling it. I can't remember.
Awesome. Yeah. Neighborhood in a square block basically is what they are, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Townhomes, row homes, brownstones, all that stuff.
Yeah. Amazing. Awesome. So you're just barely involved in the fire service, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, as I said to somebody else, work-life balance is a thing for other people.
Yeah. For sure. We're not going to unpack that today. You can talk to your therapist about that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about West Coast fire training because you guys were actually really instrumental. I don't know if you know this, but we did a nice big hose and nozzle change at our fire department. And Bonneville specifically was really, really helpful to really the lead on that project for us. Craig George, who just also happens to be my engineer. So I'm very lucky to have a dude like that on my crew. And so
Awesome.
a special thank you to you and your guys there at West Coast Fire Training for sharing tons of knowledge, one-on-one conversations, and then also helping us kind of build the class as we roll that out to the entire department. Really, really cool stuff. So overall, what are you guys doing at West Coast Fire Training?
First, I can't take credit for what Jay did for you guys. He brought all that stuff to West Coast Fire Training before we got there. We got together. But so at West Coast Fire Training, we got started because an outside department wanted some help doing some acquired structure live fire. And I'd had a fair amount of experience doing that through my own department. And so I just helped them as kind of just as a pro bono, like, yeah, sure, that sounds like fun. And a couple other departments started asking for help. And so we've slowly developed a class on how to do both fixed facility and acquired structure live fire training in a way that's more realistic in terms of fire presentation, but also maintaining a high level of safety because as the fires get bigger, there's more danger. And so you got to figure out how do you make that balance. And what we've noticed in terms of the human performance aspect is that we we started doing less and less what we call evolution based training, where okay, you pull up, hit the air brake, drop lines to the ground, mask up. We kept scaling it back and back, where guys just spent most of the time just sitting inside watching the fire because that's what we don't get a chance to do, right? When you cross the threshold at a real fire, you can't stop and just hang out because people's stuff on the line, people's lives on the line. And so taking the time to really take in the situation, getting used to certain levels of smoke, heat, and fire behavior, changing the environment by opening a window or closing a door or flowing some water and seeing how that actually affects a realistic fire, like a real looking fire. Uh, just giving folks time to actually see that really was where the value was. As soon as the fire was a real fire, there was way more value in doing less and just spending time with it because we were, and what we, and that's how we started realizing, okay, most people, they're actually still super jacked up. They're super excited when they cross the threshold. Because how many times are you actually first in on the nozzle? How many times do you actually get to search ahead of the hose line, close the door, search a room? It's not very often. And you're under super time pressure, your adrenaline's rushed. And so if we can just back that off and create those experiences, make that normal for you, the next time around it's so much easier, right? And so yeah, I wanted to normalize the live fire environment, we call it, just get people used to it. And then people needed to see how your typical firefighter skills impact the environment. But a lot of times, new people, they don't know when even if they have good skills, they don't know when to apply them because they don't have a cue built into their mind that ties when they're supposed to do the task, right? If you're crawling down a hallway and you're an inexperienced firefighter and you feel heat, you got to ask yourself, well, can I continue forward or do I have to retreat? Do I need a line? Can I make it to the door? But if you've got no perspective from that, the first time you're going down a hallway, you're just making it up as you go along, right? You know, you're supposed to get down there and close the door and use the pump can. But if you've never seen a real fire, imagine your decision making process in that moment. You're just going to make your best guess. But if we do live fire training well, we can create environments where you can educate someone like, hey, this level of heat and fire, that's too much. And then when someone gets to real fire where they experience the same conditions, now they have a cue and they know if their skill is working.
Yeah.
So
Are
that's
you guys adding any other stressors into that as that class builds, right? So you, I mean, you probably don't just go from observation station right into stretching and flowing and moving and all those sorts of things, right? So
so the first level of stress that we add is we just increase the fire behavior. So most people in training, they're used to a level of fire behavior that's very small. We call it affectionately the campfire in the corner, right? You get your 4 to 5 pallets, it hits the ceiling, it bends over a little bit, there's no real smoke. And so then you just intensify the fire so that you actually have high heat, zero visibility, and then you move people around in those conditions. So one of the things that we do after people are have we we know that people are ready is you just make a really big fire, and this is in a fixed facility. And then, you've got rollover traveling from one room to the other. The room where the rollover is in is literally zero visibility. You got that 1 inch on the floor. And so you just start people at the front door, you move them forward, you move them forward, and you move them forward until you say, hey, look up. They're like, oh, there's fire over my head. Yeah. Do you notice how you can't see that when you look straight ahead? Well, it's because the smoke's really thick. But if you look straight up, the layer is thinner between you and the rollover. So now you can see that. Oh, okay. Now put your head on the ground in that little 1 inch layer. Can you see the fire? Yes. Oh, see, remember how we told you to get your head on the ground, but you never do it because you've never been put in a situation where you have to do it, where it makes a difference. So the first way that we intensify things is just fire conditions. And we move them through conditions that they've never had to move through in training. And then if you have folks that are good skill wise and experienced, then you just throw in additional variables. So at our last fixed facility training, we had 3 folks come from a nearby department and they were super dialed in. They could have taught one of the stations, right? And so what we did is when it was their turn, we had a victim that the backup crew was supposed to find. But for this crew, we threw the victim in front of the nozzle once they got 4 feet inside. So now the crew has to make a decision. Does the, can I continue to advance with the line? How do I negotiate the victim in the doorway? How do I continue to move the hose line forward, or does the nozzle have to hold? There's a bunch of decision making and communication that they had to do, but I wouldn't have done that with a different group because they were just trying to figure out which way to go
Mhm.
as soon as they got inside. But yeah, you just ramp up the difficulty.
Yeah, and you're starting to train, that critical decision making under stress. And I think that's a thing that we forget about quite a bit. Is especially like, let's say your department is doing live fire training, and for those of you that aren't in the fire service, this just put this in your own context, right? So hopefully, whatever industry you're in, you are training, whether you're a salesperson or a cop or fire EMS, right? Like hopefully there's some training along the way, but adding complexity, we don't want to necessarily say, well, first off, well, I had to endure this, or I went through a training like this, so now I'm going to make you do it, even though it doesn't make any sense at all, right? Or creates those training scars. Or I'm going to build this grandiose thing where the space shuttle crashes into a nursing home that's next to the dog pound, right? Like, we don't need to add complexity that doesn't make any sense. But for that example right there, it's really good. You might have some people that they're really, really stressed out because even though it's a fixed facility and it's pallets and hay on fire, maybe OSB, that's really stressful to me. I hope I don't mess up, blah, 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 blah. They have this internal dialogue going on that is a super stressor. Maybe they didn't sleep the night before. Like all of those things that we've talked extensively about and will continue to on the Firefighter Craftsmanship podcast, they all play into that stress response. And we have to learn how to make cognitive decisions under that. And like you said, that might be reading the building from outside, and do I turn left or right when I go on the front door? Where might the stairs be, on a building that's harder to read with like a Connex box, burn prop, or something like that. Or you have a crew that's coming in. Well, let's also adjust it so those people get what they need. And you huck a victim in the way where, hey, what do we do? And that's a conversation, that unfortunately I think a lot of crews aren't having, is as the nozzle team, as an engine company, if we find a victim, who's doing what, right? Are we abandoning? Is the officer doing it? Are we calling the cavalry to come help us? What is it? Just start to have those conversations and then go out and rep it and see what actually works, like based on your response model, how many units you got coming in, right? Are you an outlying company where you might be on scene by yourself 12 to 15 minutes before your second unit gets there? Like all of those different things. Or do you only have two people on the rig and that's really all you're going to get for the entire thing, right? So I think just that little teeny example there is very, very important to just kind of unpack, like from a psychological perspective, that like really quality training doesn't have to be insanely complex, right? It sounds like for you guys, you're focusing more and more on simplicity and really saying, hey, did you see that? Well, no. Well, I didn't see it because I'm super stressed out and it's hotter than crap and it's dark in here. And I've never been at this facility before. Yeah, I did a walkthrough to check off the NFPA box, right? But that alone, and we've all seen it at all of our departments and all of our industries, that people are really, really stressed around the concept of failure, first off. So if you create an environment where, hey, it's okay, right? Well, how come you didn't look up? Well, because nobody's ever taught me that before. And my ears are really hot right now, right? So I think
Yeah.
really, really good stuff. Really good stuff.
The other thing too, if it comes to simplicity, well, let me back up. The first thing we do is when we're doing these trainings, we tell people that that's what we're working on, right? Right up front, you say, "Hey, we're not working on skills. Like day one, we'll work on skills just to make sure that you're going to be successful when we start doing the drills." But when we're doing the drills, we're not focusing on skill development. We're focusing on stress exposure training, and we're focusing on getting used to the live fire environment. So you give people permission to actually focus on those things. So in most live fire training, we focus on getting another rep in. And so people don't know what to do. And when they're stressed, they don't understand how to focus on managing that. And the other piece too is it just gives you permission to slow way down. The other thing too is if you tell people, hey, we're going to focus on you getting better at managing the stress and getting used to a live fire situation. Well, when they're stressed out, they feel okay saying, like, okay, I'm going to limit myself to here because I want you to be successful. I don't want to push you to failure. Because something else we've talked about that maybe the audience should know is that if you push people to beyond failure in training, that undermines their self-efficacy later on, right? They're more likely to think, "Oh, I'm going to fail because I failed in training,"
Mhm.
right? Especially if we make failure not okay in training. And so to me, when you create training failures and then you wonder, you shouldn't be surprised when guys stand outside of a house with fire coming out of two rooms and they say, "Oh, that's too dangerous to go inside." Because you created a training scar. Hey, if I can't survive that in a fixed facility, like there's no way I can survive it in a real house because their confidence is destroyed.
Mhm.
For instance, a story I like to tell is that it was actually the first round of acquired structures we did way back at the beginning. We did a day's worth of training with this shift. And at the end of the day, one of the lieutenants said, "Hey, that last fire that we just did, up until today, I would have listed that as a defensive fire and we would have started from the outside. But now I am comfortable with the gal on my tailboard going through the front door and making a left-hand turn and flowing and moving down the hallway because I know what's in there, right? I know the conditions that she's going to face at the front door. I have confidence in her ability to read the conditions and apply water down the hallway. I know that the back of the living room is still tenable. I know that the bedrooms in the back are even more tenable. And it's nothing had really changed, right? Their skill set hadn't changed because we hadn't done a lot of skills work. Um, their response model hadn't changed, staffing hadn't changed, but now they understood the environment and they were confident in the environment. And so suddenly something it going inside is an easy choice now.
Yeah.
So
Awesome stuff. And so much there, right? Just from like the how training should be designed perspective. Right. It's not just about, well, what's the schedule look like and how fast can we churn people through here? Yes, that's always a part of it. And it costs money to train. But also like what are the clear objectives? And then have we communicated those objectives? That's a huge de-stressor right there. And that those little actions right there, if you have an organization that is struggling with the blue flu, meaning every time we have a good solid training like live fire training and you have a good majority and the same people calling in sick every single time, there's a mental component to that of, hey, how do we change organizational culture? It starts with, well, how do we view success and how do we view failure? Are we eating our own young? um, and really it probably starts in the fire academy, right? Of what is acceptable, how do we create learning environments, and then how do we carry those through? And I think really the fact of the matter is the people that are instructing those classes have to eat their egos first off and have that big old slice of humble pie throughout. And when you do that, you learn so much more than the students actually learn because, man, I thought that tactic was going to work really, really well. And now that I kind of detach from that and I look at it, it doesn't. I mean, it kind of works, but it's probably not the best. Let's pivot and go this direction instead and try that, right? Like those are, I think, the things that when you have those cultures now, you empower the students to actually learn so much, even though they're still following the curriculum and they still are following within those objectives of whatever the class is. But now they're empowered to actually learn within that and grow themselves and the class, right?
yeah, and I think something we have to remember is that people joining the fire service and people in the fire service are motivated adults, right? These are not people who are being there because they're forced to be there by a court order, right? These are people who want to be good at the job And especially in most academies, you had to compete pretty hard to get there. And there's a lot of good, developed scientific literature about how to teach motivated adults. And unfortunately, a lot of academies still don't embrace that. They embrace kind of the 1970s, boot camp military model of I will break you down and build you back up again because you're a worthless piece of junk who had no other opportunities in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like come on, these people just want to learn, they just want to be good. And so
Yeah.
there's no need. I always used to argue that the academy is stressful enough. I don't need to make it more stressful. And the other thing too that people don't realize is that when you add stress of, hey, you're a piece of crap and I'm going to fire you if you don't make it, if people are able to endure that stress, great, but it doesn't prepare them for the stress of the job, right? Stress training, as you know, is very specific, right? Which is why a lot of firefighters are comfortable on emergency scenes, but they're not comfortable speaking in public,
Mhm.
right? If stress training were a panacea across everything, then firefighters wouldn't be stressed out in any situations, right? People who are comfortable singing songs in concerts would be good at responding to emergencies, but that's not how it is. It's very specific to the situation. And so if you yell at students in training and they're able to withstand that, that just means they're able to withstand being yelled at. That doesn't mean they're going to be any good on the fire scene.
Yeah.
Uh,
They're probably actually just really good at tuning you out, right?
yes.
If you're yelling at them, and I've had the lucky opportunities along the way to instruct and stuff, and I've definitely made some dumb mistakes, and I've treated people that I look back on it now, and I'm like, I've reached out to some of those people and been like, hey man, I really apologize. And most of them are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Right. Like, so I'm certainly not immune to being a complete bozo and treating people that I certainly would not want to be treated. But the more that I learn about this stuff, the more it's important that we really take that into account. And I can guarantee you, for me personally, I'm not talking about making stuff easier and I'm not talking about getting soft. And I know that Ian isn't either, right? Like he's pushing the envelope here about no, let's actually burn acquired structures with firefighters inside them so that we can learn. That's a heavy, heavy battle to fight in the name of safety and all of those sorts of things. So that's not what we're talking about at all.
You have to make it hard in the right way,
Mhm.
right? It's like if I told a, a lifting coach, like, hey, I really want to get my bench up to X number of pounds. And then he brought me in and said, hey, okay, today we're going to run on the treadmill for 2 hours. Be like, what are you talking about? Well, you're going to get your body used to the stress.
Mm.
Like, no, no. Like, you got to put weight on the bar. And it's the same with stress exposure, right? You wouldn't, yeah, it it's just not the same. You can make things extremely hard. You just have to make it hard in the right way.
Yeah. That's a brilliant example, right? And you also wouldn't start there if your max rep was 155 pounds on the bench. You wouldn't start him at 225, right?
Right.
Like,
And
even
then
though
say,
that's their goal, right? I
why do
want to
you
bench
suck?
225. Well, we're not starting you there today, right? Even if you can one rep max 225, we're still not starting you there. We're starting you way back and we're using progression and good scientific thought behind this stuff so we don't hurt you, right? And I think that you're doing a great job there, and it's really really cool to see that, and hopefully this stuff is starting to leach out into the population, and I know that it is because you and I both have been involved at regional fire conferences, and that's kind of the cool thing about those is nobody's signing up and taking your class if it's full of a bunch of bravado and you just talk about what fire department you work for. Big deal, man. Yeah, you might run a lot more calls than me, but what can you teach me? I don't really,
Exactly.
I'm not enamored by the bright lights anymore. I want to know what you can teach me. And even if that's a little teeny nugget, because I got a lot of stuff to learn, and make it relevant, and how do we treat each other as humans, and how do we push this thing forward. And I think you made a great point right at the beginning is, fire, police, EMS, it's a really hard job to get. And we even talk about how much turnover there is and burnout and recruitment and retention being a problem. It's still really hard to get for sure into police and fire, right? And
Yeah,
so those people that are there, like you said, are willing to raise their hand. And like Dr. Barb Thompson talked about on the recent podcast episode of, like, those are some of the most courageous people on the planet when they raise their hand, that. And we've heard that quote before. That's the hardest thing they'll ever do, is actually take the oath. Like everything else is just kind of a part of the job. And so I think that that's a thing. Like, let's stop with this bravado nonsense and teach me something, especially if your academy is 12 to 20 weeks. It's not really very long if we expect them to have a 20 to 30-year career, right?
for sure. For sure. Though,
Stuff.
I mean, this is an aside. I've always felt like the saying the oath was the hardest thing was it. I just never bought it, right? That's when you're most excited. You're in the honeymoon phase. When you're at, 7, 10 years and the shine's worn off and it's 4 o'clock in the morning and you're on your fourth like lift assist, that's and your compassion fatigue is in the toilet. That's when it gets hard for me. Is because
Yeah.
when you're still in the honeymoon phase, you're like, yeah, this is gonna be great. I'm gonna love every second of this. And then, oh yeah, it's the long term is hard, is maintaining that motivation and involvement over time. I mean, I've definitely ebbed and flowed in my motivation and went through a period where I was not really proud of who I was at the moment and had to look at myself in the mirror and be like, oh, this isn't who I wanted to be. I need to recalibrate some things. So
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Yeah, the honeymoon phase, it's pretty easy, and you don't actually know what you don't know. You're unconsciously incompetent. You don't know what you don't know. And so you're real excited, and then you get online and you realize how much poop is involved in emergency services. Like literal human poop, right? So that you're right. So at fourth or fifth get up, especially if you're on that 4896, or right, you don't have any days off, you're getting mandoed. That is the most courageous part of it, for sure, no doubt about it. And maybe even the most courageous part of it is when you say, okay, I've reached my limit. I'm either taking some time off or I'm pivoting out and doing something else, right? And that number, I've been talking about this a lot, and people look at me like, well, I'm a cyborg, when I'd say, well, you don't necessarily have to do 20 or 30 years. It's okay if you do 7 or 3 or whatever your number is, right? Like, it's different for everybody. And I think we kind of need to normalize that conversation. And how do we establish groups like West Coast Fire Training that are helping people be super successful while they're here? They're encouraging and they're pushing people to crush it. And the expectation is really, really high. This is what the customer expects internally and externally. Um, but then go do something else and use those concepts that we just taught you on how to develop training and things like that in a stair step progression, and de-stress some of the common stressors that we just aren't exposed to. Like, what is it actually like to be inside of a building that is on fire, right?
yeah, I think the other thing that's important about designing good training and making your people as competent as possible is, we've all been on difficult runs that weren't successful, right? Where somebody died or more than one person died or kids were involved. And at least myself and my crew, we often come back to, hey, the outcome wasn't successful, but we did as well as we could, right? We were at our highest level of performance. There's nothing we could have done better. We were squared away individually. Our teamwork was solid. Our response time was solid, right? And so you can rest on that, right? And part of that yeah, it's just when you can take solace in the process and you don't look back and or look at the ceiling in the middle of the night and be like, man, if I just done that a little bit better, that's where you start losing sleep.
Mhm.
And I mean, part of that is focus being process focused versus outcome focused. I think a lot of people could learn a lot about that subject, which I know you're into. And then also if you've done the best you can, you just like, yeah, okay, I'm good. I'm proud of myself regardless of the outcome. So
Yeah. And the key component is to that, if you put in the work, you can't lie to
yes.
yourself, right? And that
Yeah, I
maybe
think that's
that's
how
some of the
you lose
mental
that
toll,
sleep.
Yeah, indeed. Some of the mental toll, I think, probably too, is I always want to push and do more and more and more and more and more. And then we need to build those environments like you're talking about with your company and your crew there of okay, now we've done enough. Like we trained really hard on CPR skills and we understand how that whole works with the ambulance and the surrounding companies and all of that stuff. Like we did everything we can, and at the end of the day it sucks and I'm going to be emotional about it, and that's okay. But we did everything that we possibly could and gave them the best chance that we could. And I think that that is probably that balance of, it falls back into maybe the hardest part of the job, right? Is taking that solace and just resting on, hey, our basic skills were there. It did not turn out in the result that we wanted, and we learned a ton from it. But we have to move forward for the next one. That also might not work out, right?
Yeah.
So what kind
Yeah.
of
And when we talk,
conversations, sorry to cut you off. What kind of conversations are you guys having at the crew level with your guys and girls on your crews? Like, what does that look like in a day-to-day operation? How are you guys talking about some of this stuff?
well, philosophically, it's always trying to establish a learning culture, right? Where you're trying to get better every time and that we can all learn from each other, right? Not just them learning from me as the captain, but me learning from them, even if it's a guy straight on probation, there's still something he might be able to offer, if only just another set of eyes in a complex, fast moving situation. Right. So just establishing a learning culture, um, keeping positive, right? And then, like we said, progressive training. We're going to start here. We have a plan for where we want to be, next shift, next month, 6 months down the line, and being willing to address weaknesses, you know, in a concrete way, and it's not personal, right? So when I have a little get together with my driver and I say, hey, this is where I expect you to be. And 6 months down the line, I have that conversation again. This is where I expected you to be. You're not there. What's going on? And we can have a frank conversation about, what the challenges are and how I can help them either meet expectations or deal with the outside challenges, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really good. And are you using any like formal feedback systems or processes or like a schedule or anything like that?
I meet with each person on my crew every 6 months formally, and then we have open dialogue continuously, right? As part of that learning culture, right? And I find, especially as the officer, it's really important that I really support my crew's attempts to give feedback to me or to other senior members. I got some feedback from one of my tailboarders about how I'd said something to another crew, and he was super soft about it. And he was very, very apologetic about trying to give me feedback. And it was a moment, right, that I could have walked by, but I had to be very intentional and say, look, I've said before, I'll say it again, this is a learning environment, and that means you need to be able to give me feedback. So thank you for giving me feedback. Let's talk all about it. Let's break it down. Don't kind of just touch on it for a second. I want you to break down the whole interaction, say what you didn't like, why you didn't like it, where you're coming from, so we can have an honest conversation about it as opposed to, oh yeah, I hear you, buddy. Okay. Yeah, I'll try and be better next time. No, I, especially as the officer, have to model how we discuss that and how we break it down for the whole crew. And especially in the situation now that we're in my department, where it is very common that I have more time in the fire department than all three other members of my crew put together,
Mhm.
sometimes twice as much. Just because we're hiring so many people right now, we've had such a turnover in the last 5 years.
Yeah. Really cool stuff. Yeah, building, you're being really intentional on building the cultures that you want to be a part of, right? And you didn't
Yeah.
say one thing about, well, my organization does this really well or doesn't do this well. No, like that's just within your sphere of influence and your sphere of control. And then also allowing the people that work alongside you who we're blessed to work with, right? Like you already talked about how many great people are in the game. Um, Help them also build that, and you're leading them by showing them, hey, all right, you come in with a bunch of bravado, okay, that's fine, but I'm gonna go first, and you can give me feedback. I think it's really really good stuff.
I mean, to talk up my department, I feel like we have come a long way as a department in general. Like a lot of the skills that I was talking about, I've learned from people around me in my department. We've really come a long way towards creating a drill environment that is a learning environment. When I first came in, it was very, very much the opposite, you know. Um, and now we're at a point where after almost all company drills, people are very open and honest about what they could have done better. People are good at providing positive, constructive feedback and receiving it well. So, I mean, yeah, my department's in a very good place, I feel like, in terms of that stuff at the company and the department level. So it's not just me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I would venture to guess that was from people that didn't have a lot of bars on their collar, right? That made that organizational change.
I would say we've been lucky that it's almost at every level. Like some of it's been pushed from the bottom, of course, right? Many of the best ideas in the fire service are from the people who are doing the day-to-day work. But and I want to support people in that, but what you got to remember is that implementing positive change like that always requires upper level support, right? Because your deputy chiefs of training, your chiefs of department, they can crush that stuff really easily if they want to. And so we I'd say it's been support kind of at every level, right? When people from the bottom said, "Hey, we want to establish a training culture that's more like this, so we need to be able to select our instructors for for certain qualities." Well, then the deputy chief of training said, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We definitely need that. Um, Tell me how you want to do it, and then I'll back your play so that when people complain about not being involved in the training, I'll be able to tell them, this is why we're going in this direction." Or when a senior officer or a senior firefighter complains about, "Hey, I'm getting this direct feedback in a way I don't like." Well, then the deputy chief of training says, "Hey, this is where we're going." And you as a senior officer, they can have that sort of mentor or up, senior member conversation with a deputy, with a battalion chief, and say, "Hey, look, chief, you need to give your troops feedback in this way." And that's hard to do as, a firefighter or a lieutenant who might be trying to drive positive training change if you don't have support at the upper management level to, because how are you going to give, some battalion chief with their heels dug in on the old way feedback as, an 8-year firefighter? It's going to be really hard. But if you got the deputy chief or the chief of the department on your side, well, then they can back your play and kind of squash it from both ends.
Yeah.
Or even with the live fire training stuff, like I was bringing all these new ideas and not by myself, but with other people to the department. Well, all of that would have died if the deputy chief of training hadn't said, "Yes, let me
Mm.
give you money for that."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's great. And I think it really kind of builds on the podcast episode where we had with Preston Lyons, where he, focused a lot on positive organizational change and involving all of the stakeholders, involving that deputy, district, division, whatever chief in that training, or making it less scary for them too, right? Especially, I mean, if you're a big muckety muck as the chief of or deputy district division chief level, I mean, you're sticking your neck out if you're letting some junior firefighter come in and talk about acquired structure live fire training, right? Like that the consequences at that higher level of the organization are pretty big. Plus, they have a lot of work that they're doing, right? And they're trying to make positive gains, or based on economies, trying to survive without laying people off or whatever the thing is going on, right? They are just always doing big project ticket items. And so for us at whatever organizational level you are, especially if you're towards the bottom, you have to realize that. And then we also got to make sure that we're treating those people the way that we're expecting to be treated, right? Not just sitting around and talking smack at the kitchen table.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing I often preach, with training and with program development is patience, right? As firefighters, we're used to solving our problems in, you know, 10 minutes. And if you have a good fire, it might be an hour.
Yeah.
So we're not good at saying, hey, I'm going to build this crew over the next year and a half.
Mm.
How do I plan for that long term where we're going to be interrupted a bunch? How do I go to the chief and say, I want to sell this program? And the first time around, the chief says no. And do I get mad and disaffected and say, screw this place? Nobody understands. Or do I just wait for 2 years for that chief to retire? And then the next chief comes in who used to be your buddy, at the neighboring station. And now you say, hey, chief, you remember that thing we used to complain about at the beanery table? Because you're still positive, you're still involved, you're just keeping that on the back burner, right? If you could just build that patience and build over time, it's amazing what you can get done.
Yeah. And if you offer coaching services and patience, I will pay you right now. As anybody that knows
Yeah,
me personally knows that is not a forte of mine, but something that is
hard won lessons.
for sure. For sure. Um, let's talk a little bit about task saturation. I've had a great conversation about that and got to read some drafts of an article from you regarding task saturation. So, what are some of the things that you guys are looking at for task saturation, either with your involvement with your side gig, with your department as a captain, with your crew, or even with the NFPA, right? Like, are we asking too much of people on emergency scenes?
I think in certain cases, absolutely. And I think that when you read, you know, line of duty death reports or other close call reports, and they talk about losing situational awareness as though that were saying that, hey, just get better at that. At a certain point, we have to recognize the limitations of human performance. I mean, you and I are talking about how we can increase human performance, and that's great. But at a certain point, you have to realize that people are going to be maxed out, right? You can't just add more memory or more hardware up here. And so, from an individual training perspective, that's why we've simplified the live fire training, because we've realized that if you're asking people to do tasks, you can't teach them about fire behavior inside the building because they're paying attention to the task because of what we know about splitting attention, right? You can only do one thing at a time. And if you're multitasking, you're just doing two things badly. So we take away the tasks during training and focus on the most important thing that they need to learn in that moment. It might be a skill, it might be fire behavior recognition, whatever. Then on scene, as an officer, I just have to recognize that the folks who are doing the work, there's certain a number of things that they're not going to be able to pay attention to. And the more involved they are in their individual task, the less I'm going to be able to expect of them in terms of paying attention to what's going on around them. It's also admitting to myself as an officer that there's going to be things that I probably won't see, especially if it's a fast moving incident. And so that means when somebody else says, hey, did you see this? you got to provide space. That's why it's important to create that collegial interactive team so that your tailboarder does feel comfortable coming to you saying, "Hey, LT, hey, Cap, hey, Chief, I think this is a basement fire. You're telling me to go through the front door, but I'm pretty sure this is a basement fire." And you have to be open as the officer to reconsidering your position. Did I miss something on my 360?
Mm.
And just understand the fallibilities of human perception. In terms of NFPA, I don't see much on the committees that I'm working in involved with that. Um, so
Okay.
that's mostly about rules and regulations for live fire training. Um, but I think, getting people, one of the things we can do for training is getting people to relax, like basically stress exposure training, right? If we can reduce their stress, then we can reduce their perceptual narrowing, right? They're less likely to have tunnel vision, less likely to have auditory exclusion, all that stuff we've talked about.
Yeah.
Then going back to training hard, excuse me, if we can, we need to make sure that the basic skills that we're shooting for are as good as we possibly can make them. Because once the skills are automatic, they take less brain power.
Mhm.
It's just like being able to drive and change the radio to talk to your partner at the same time. It's because driving is automatic now. And so it's the same with our fireground skills. The more automatic they are, the more I can pay attention to what else is going on around me.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's really the basis and the impetus of basic skills training, right? That's why it's easy for us to measure basic skills. It's easy for us really to train basic skills. Everybody's kind of on the same page, especially if they've been through the academy. And organizationally, you have those basic skills conversations. But that's why basic skills in emergency services training is so important. So it creates that automaticity, right? Or it's an automatic. I know how to throw a ladder or pull it off the rig and throw it in all variable conditions in the dark with zero sleep, all of those things. I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about, well, where's the best place to throw it? So there's the cognitive tie into that. I'm not super stressed that I can't throw the 24 or the 28, et cetera. So I think that's a really, really good tie-in. And I think that's kind of where that crossover for training a lot of times stops is we train basic skills so you can crush it when you get out on the emergency scene and you need them. Yes. But then at what point do we add in those other cognitive training things? Maybe not in the Proby Academy, right? But for sure, like if somebody's going to go through an acting lieutenant's academy or something like that, they need to start understanding how their brains work, understanding how cognitive processing and under stress works, human psychology, how does that work? Like all of those things, it shouldn't be the very first time they've ever done an on-scene report, And so like all of those things, plus their stress level when you finally act as an officer for the very first time, your stress level is through the roof, And so, and of course, that's usually when good stuff happens.
Right.
As far as for all the surrounding companies, at least, they're getting to go to fires then.
Yeah. And how do we get people even to be self aware enough to know when they're overloaded?
Mm. Yeah.
Right. Because sometimes we've all seen it, especially even almost most often in Proby academies, you get the Proby that you're talking to, and their eyes are because they're just so internally focused because they're so stressed out. How do we get people to be able to recognize when they're on that edge and how to reset themselves?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I've never told this story on the podcast before, but I was involved in a recruit academy. And it was not from my organization, thank goodness, but the chief of department came out and had all the recruits form up and then lit into them and said, quote, "We don't pay you to think. You just need to do." And uh yeah, we had a long conversation about as the instructors after that chief left of I adamantly disagree with that. Like we definitely pay you to think and we pay you
Well,
to do, you know?
well, it's back to that. That's back to that 1960s, 70s military mentality, right? I don't need you to think. I need you to climb out of this trench and charge to the next trench,
Yeah.
right? We're well beyond that now. It's funny sometimes the people who are most into that military mindset don't realize that now is in the fire service, we're probably 10 years behind where the military is. Like
Mhm.
they abandoned all that stuff long ago, right?
Right. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and luckily that chief didn't last very long from a different fire department. And shocking, right? Like when you come into
Yeah,
the
amazing.
game with that, yeah. He got ran out relatively quickly, which I think would be good. Thank goodness I did never have to work for that. So, really good stuff. So, let's talk about that kind of internal focus, right? That self-attention and internal focus. What does that mean? And then how does that kind of play into the real world?
Well, as I mean, as you know from some of the stuff you've sent me to read, and the more when you get stressed out, especially in unfamiliar situations, you start to become what they call internally focused, and you're trying to figure out what is your place in this emergency situation. How does this thing that's happening out there, what does that mean for me? Um, and so, like, basically, I mean, a simple scenario that I wrote about this is, the probies crawling down the hallway with the hose line, and it's hot and it's dark. They've never been here before. And so rather than paying attention to everything that's going on around them and listening and feeling the heat, no, their mind's inside. Am I okay? Can I stop advancing? I'm afraid if I stop, will I get condemned? Do I go forward? Am I going to die? Like all this internal dialogue starts to happen, which actually makes you less aware of the things that are going on around you. And so if we can get people used to the environment ahead of time, then they have that perspective on what it means to them, right? That's why, again, why we try and put people in realistic fire environments as much as possible in training so that the first time they arrive at an actual incident and they're crawling down a dark, hot hallway, they say, okay, this, I know what this means to me. Yeah, this is this much heat. I saw this in training. They said if I encountered this much heat, I should open the line. Okay, I'm going to open the line. And I saw a bunch of videos and I saw my buddy do this and he was successful. So I'm just going to do that. And so now I'm externally focused again. I'm actually paying attention to what's going on around me. But if I have no reference for what any of this means, what any of this looks like, then suddenly I have to figure all that out.
Yeah. Really good stuff. And all of those things that you just talked about are based in heavily, heavily studied scientific, social scientific principles and theories, right? Lots of psychology there as well. And that's just the reality of it, right? We're dealing with humans. We are humans, the human experience. And then all of that stuff that you come into the job with affects you, right? Trait, state anxiety. We've talked about a lot of this stuff already on the Firefighter Craftsmanship podcast. And it's really important as we all continue to try to progress ourselves and our crews and our departments, our organizations. All of this stuff matters. And so that's where it's so important that we just continue to nerd out a little bit on some performance psychology principles and how do we deliver great training, how do we build great training environments. And I think if we can continue to build great training environments and then great training classes, everything gets better up the chain, right? And that has to
100%.
start in probationary academies. It has to.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because you have to introduce the ideas early, right? People don't, this kind of stuff does not come naturally,
Mhm.
right? It's not a normal thing to think about all this internal state stuff. And so if you don't introduce it and make it concrete, then people will struggle at best to get better at it. Right. Some of the things that always makes me frustrated is people want to increase they'll want to do stress exposure training, but they don't want to tell people that they're doing stress exposure training.
Mhm.
Like they think it'll be better, or that they're cheating if they tell the students, "Hey, we're going to stress you out to make you more stress resistant." Well, just tell them.
Mhm.
Just going back to the working out example, it's like, "Hey, man, we're going to work on squats today. So we're going to do this warm up for that, and then we're going to do these reps for that." Like, uh, I don't, it's much easier if you just tell people, "Hey, we're working on stress exposure training. This is how the progression works. This is what we're going to start with, and we're going to move on to this thing, and we're going to move on to this thing. By the way, if it gets too hard, just let us know, and we'll keep you right here. So you're just getting pushed a little bit, but we're not going to tear anything."
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're spot on. And over communicating that, it doesn't make it less stressful, right? It might, in
Yeah,
times, it might even make it more stressful. Like, oh man, they told us they're going to give us the beats, right? And so, but also stress training and stress inoculation training, or whatever word you want to use, doesn't mean just making them do like log PT, like you're the Navy SEALs either, right? Like we have to
yeah,
make stress training relevant to what are they actually going to see on the street, and then how do we help them unpack that, right? So at the end of the day, when they make it through and they accomplish all these physical feats, do we help them down regulate and de-stress and give them tools? Hey, when you go home, work on this stuff, or do we just say,
right.
all right, see you tomorrow, maybe we'll do that again, maybe we won't, right? Like that's not helpful.
Yeah, and telling people the normal human reactions to stressful events. Like, okay, you go on a CPR that's unsuccessful and pretty traumatic because of what's going on with the family. By the way, when you go home, don't be surprised if you're thinking about it all the time for like the next 48 hours. That doesn't mean you're broken. That doesn't mean you've got PTSD. That's just normal processing of a super stressful event, right? And this is the progression of how your processing is going to go. And by the way, if you reach, 3 weeks out and you're still losing sleep, yeah, okay, maybe come back and we can talk to a professional. But
Mhm.
sometimes people think, I get the impression that people think that they're broken just because they're thinking a lot about something horrible that happens. Like, man, that's normal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Or even thinking about the ones where you're like, I can't figure out why this one's bothering me. I
Yeah,
think that that's it too, right? It's like, well, something connected there. And so if you're experiencing those things and those emotional reactions and those even physiological reactions or even physiological changes for an acute amount of time, totally normal. When it starts to become chronic, or you don't unpack any of those acute experiences, then you have a problem, right? And so that is one piece of wellness. Peer support training is a great way, or peer support involvement, or talking to, or a clinician is a great thing for that. But sometimes so is just going on a walk without any music or anything in your ears, and your phone is in your pocket, but never comes out, and you just walk and breathe through your nose, right? Like,
right,
for
right.
sure. Yeah, and I think we
Perfect.
could even take that one step farther, is like, how do we train um, and have those conversations with the family unit or the peer groups when people go home, of, hey, there is a transition, and the farther I get into my fire service career, the more well, I never even thought about it until very recently, right? But now, like, starting to create routines on my way home from work, what happens in the driveway, right? Like those sorts of things, and then also setting expectations for myself and for the family, of saying, well, today is an opportunity where we got up 3-4 times last night, we essentially got 0 minutes of sleep, we worked to 48. I'm smoked. Today, it doesn't look like we have anything going on. I'm going to go in and take a nap, or hopefully go to bed for at least an hour and a half, like one sleep cycle. And then I come out, and now they have an expectation of that. But then I have an expectation of myself when I come out, that I'm not going to just be a grumpy turd all day on the things that I can, like, legitimately choose to be nice or not nice about, you know? And I think that those are the conversations that also need to help. And that helps with recruitment, retention, burnout, and helps with healthy relationships both on and off the job. It's really important.
100%. I completely agree. Having a
Yeah.
strong support system at home. I feel very lucky that I've had that, someone, my wife's got a lot of psychological education. And so just having that ability to relate and understand and support what I'm going through has been super helpful over the years.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't imagine what it'd be like to not have an effective support system with your family at home.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's probably an opportunity for all of our organizations to maybe look at that. And no, it doesn't have to cost a bunch of money, right?
Yeah,
Just even those conversations, but also that your partner doesn't have to be a pincushion for all your nonsense either, right? Like that's not fair to them either. They're not going to stick around for that, nor really should
no,
they.
no.
Yeah. Well, everybody thought we were just going to talk about live fire training today, and now we got into the weeds on some of this stuff, right? Really good
Oh,
stuff.
it's the firefighter craftsmanship podcast. They knew we were going to get into human performance. Come on.
There it is.
Live fire was just the vehicle.
That's it. That's it. Well, great stuff. And I think you're doing some awesome things and you're putting some really heavily studied theories into play. And doing it at your level. And, you know, every person I've ever talked to that's taken a West Coast fire training class or has had any interaction with you personally is had just nothing but positive things to say. And not
Oh,
one of them
thanks.
has said, oh, it was like so easy, it wasn't worth my time, right? Like that's not what they've ever said. So I think you can do both, right? You can provide really good training that sometimes might be hard if it's relevant to be hard. Um, but you can also educate people in an environment where they come back and they learned a lot of stuff. And then sometimes from those, they create massive positive organizational change. It's really cool. That's not being soft, right?
No.
Yeah. So how can people find you?
So pretty much Facebook or the website. So westcoastfiretraining.com is the website, and then Facebook is just West Coast Fire Training. Um, so the website has my email. So a lot of times email from there goes to spam. So I try and check that regularly. But if I don't get back to you on email, either hit me up again or Facebook Messenger is always pretty consistent. So those are the two big ones.
Fantastic. Thanks for your time today. I learned a bunch from you. I like talking to you every time because I definitely learn
Oh,
new
same.
cooler ways to say it or new angles on how to be a little bit better. So get really good stuff. Really appreciate you spending some time with us.
Oh, anytime.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for listening to Firefighter Craftsmanship Podcast. If you're looking for more stuff from Ian, he had a great weekly scrap podcast, episode 242, where they dive pretty heavily into live fire training and some of that stuff. For all of you engine company nerds out there, you can go check out Weekly Scrap 242. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. Please rate, review, and share the Firefighter Craftsmanship Podcast. That's how we grow this thing from a grassroots effort. And stay smart.